Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, how are you this morning?
Doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing well. We are continuing through the SNI mempool crash course. We're actually almost through with it at this point. And last week, we talked about the article, Who Controls Bitcoin, which kind of led to discussions about forks and nodes and so on. And this part of the mempool crash course is focusing, more broadly on kind of the different attempts to basically sway Bitcoin in different directions. So we're now getting into a few articles that were written in 2014, effectively about, you could say, government attacks on Bitcoin, but also just you could generalize that into, broader coordinated attacks on Bitcoin of certain forms, which we'll get into. So today's article is one, actually, so the next two articles, the one we're doing today and the one we're doing tomorrow, were actually written on the same day or published on the same day in 2014. So today we're doing the first of them, called Bitcoin's Rugged Individualism, by Daniel Krawisz. And this came out, like the next one, on June 29th, 2014. The price was $600. And, I would say at this time, there really hadn't been too much government involvement in Bitcoin. Besides, I might posit, I guess there had been the Silk Road shutdown, obviously. And I think by this point, I don't remember when specifically in 2014, but it was in 2014 that the IRS declared that Bitcoin was to be treated as property. And it was sort of around this time that FinCEN was starting to announce kind of its first regulatory ideas about Bitcoin. But at this point, things were still very much the Wild West in terms of Bitcoin's relations to the government. Perhaps you have some more details on this time period of 2014. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has. Yeah, I think you pretty much covered it.
Yeah, and I guess do you remember, when did the bit license get established in New York?
I think it was right around then with Ben Losky, or they were doing hearings about it.
Yeah, so I guess this is kind of like this is in that time period where these kind of first passes at government regulation towards Bitcoin was coming out, and so it kind of made sense that this was a good time for articles about the nature of bureaucracy, as well as how governments can or cannot actually respond to Bitcoin would come out. So that's what we're talking about today, Bitcoin's rugged individualism. And I want to point out that the image, which if you're only listening, you wouldn't see, but the image at the top is a screenshot or a still from the phenomenal movie Brazil, directed by Terry Gilliam. I think it was maybe 1984 or so. And it is a brilliant satire of bureaucracy and sort of almost like a comedic 1984, but 1984 is much more focused on the surveillance aspect of a totalitarian government, whereas Brazil is very much just knee deep, neck deep in the bureaucracy. So it's still showing one of the government rooms where there's just endless, guys in very drab suits running around with bureaucratic documents trying to figure things out, which I think does describe a lot of, the bureaucracy that exists in the modern state. So Highly recommend that movie just in general, but it also, as we'll see, kind of relates to what we're talking about here. Bitcoin and the agency problem. Whereas for earlier monies, it was generally the case that most people could expect to be better off storing the bulk of their money with agents, for Bitcoin, the opposite is true. The Bitcoin network obviates traditional financial institutions, and there are really only two agents that Bitcoin users need: exchanges and payment processors. The exchanges are temporary. They are only required because fiat currencies require them. Once the fiat currencies have died, centralized currency exchanges will no longer be required. As for payment processors, they are only required over timescales of about an hour or less to ensure a transaction gets into the blockchain. With Bitcoin, there is no need for anything like a bank that would store Bitcoins over a long term. And this paragraph is slightly confusing in the modern, I say modern, but 10 years on, the exchange part is very true in that it's sort of this kind of render under Caesar thing where you have to deal with exchanges to go between fiat and Bitcoin, but that obviously only exists as a need insofar as you actually need to go between fiat and Bitcoin. If you are earning your money in Bitcoin and you are paying expenses in Bitcoin, obviously there's not even a need to touch an exchange. But insofar as you need access to fiat liquidity, then an exchange is there. As far as the payment processor as being described here, this had to do with kind of early views of dealing with zero confirmation payments and such, and even today, there were things like BitPay that were helping people, basically generate addresses and receive Bitcoin. But in some sense, I think that was just it was a lack of good open source infrastructure, because obviously something like BitPay, famously obviated BTC Pay Server obviated or obsoleted BitPay, as Nicolas Dorier's famous tweet declared, in which case you can have your own payment processing where it's handling more of kind of different invoicing and such. But the actual idea of making sure a transaction gets into the blockchain, that's really just that's something that you can monitor on an individual level, and BTC Pay watches for however many confirmations you want to watch for, and otherwise just make sure that people pay a sufficient fee. Being nearly superfluous is not the only problem with Bitcoin agents. To whomsoever a private key to a Bitcoin address is known, the Bitcoins it holds are far easier to control than dollars or gold are under almost any circumstance. This is because controlling Bitcoins is simply a matter of keeping a number secret and requires neither securing physical matter, as with gold, or the permission of issuers, as with dollars. Thus, there is a fundamental agency problem with Bitcoin. Agents can disappear or simulate a heist upon themselves. They cannot rationally be trusted without extreme costs being imposed on them, which are more stringent than traditional banks. Furthermore, agents must advertise their services and consequently become the targets of hackers. They must take extreme measures to achieve a level of security similar to that which an individual person achieves with much less. The inherent agency problem in Bitcoin is born out of Bitcoin's extraordinary history of hacks and thefts. Bitcoin institutions seem to be worse than the banks that Bitcoin replaces. As Bitcoin proponents must point out repeatedly to naysayers, people lose Bitcoins not by an inherent flaw in the protocol, but by misuse. They stored them with Mt. Gox, Atlantis Market, or one of many other companies that imploded or disappeared. Bitcoin has had a problem with amateurish entrepreneurs, but I expect we will see continued failures even when established institutions attempt to use Bitcoin. I'll just continue on. Despite this,
yeah, I mean, I would argue that prediction didn't really hold up very well. Here we are 10 years later, and I think that there's been fewer hacks than this predicted.
Yes. Sorry. I was gonna just kind of read on and then go back to this, but yes, we can jump into what's been stated so far, and I think this list, and we'll include it in the show notes. This is when they talk about the extraordinary list, this is a Bitcoin Talk post that was posted in April of 2014, but updated up through November 2014, which implied that there were many more, and it even says that there were entries remaining on the backlog. And this page is just absolutely wild, and people interested in the wild west of early Bitcoin should definitely go take a look. It looks at all of the different collapses and incidents and thefts and so on, with relevant links to Bitcoin Talk threads about those events and looking at the amount. So a lot of these, the Mt. Gox collapse famously was 850,000 Bitcoins, and plenty of these were hundreds of Bitcoins at the time, and lots of Bitcoin stolen. So yeah, just thousands of Bitcoin stolen. Just a lot of things happening. So it really was just a very crazy time, and one where to say amateurish entrepreneurs is sort of an understatement in my opinion. And I think, yes, I think that we've seen a lot fewer hacks. That being said, I think there's two sides of this to consider. One is that the fundamental counterparty risks really are there, and in fact, they're not as it's not as obvious that just using a third party is the easy, secure way that some people want it to be, versus something like self-custody. But then on the other hand, as far as these institutions, they have very much professionalized, and now we can perhaps get a little upset about government regulation of institutions, but there are also in the market self-regulating incentives of any free market, and both of these force different kinds of practices to be adopted. And so very few of these, I don't think anyone's going to be leaving money with major institutions that are not in compliance with standard computer security principles and so on and so forth. Like SOC 2 accounting controls and stuff like that.
Yeah, I feel like it's anti-fragile. So they essentially learned from all those hacks. Now, knock on wood, because Coinbase could get hacked tomorrow, and then I'd be eating crow. So on one hand, you have the organizations that have evolved their security practices, and that's a form of anti-fragility. And then on the other hand, there's people who just, what the lesson they took away from that is, don't trust these institutions, don't hold your Bitcoin with them. But that, I think, mainly affected the people who were around back then, I suppose, and who lost money at FTX. Those people learned their lesson the hard way. Whereas somebody who's kept their Bitcoin at Coinbase for the past, however many years, they haven't learned that lesson. And I think that for Bitcoiners, it's like, okay, well, we could take an accelerationist view and hope that Coinbase gets hacked so that all these people learn to not keep their Bitcoin there. And that's kind of a normative view. The other would be just the positive view of, well, let's think about why Coinbase hasn't been hacked, and not really have a position on whether that's good or bad, or even that really taking it as far as possible of saying the government should make it illegal for third parties to hold Bitcoin like this.
So something I would point out, though, is Coinbase itself has not, gotten hacked. But what we do see, and what's related to what I was saying about the various forms of counterparty risk, is that While Coinbase itself has not been hacked, I mean there have been some incidents of different kinds where different. I think there was. I might have this totally wrong, and I'm not trying to. If it's wrong, disregard it. It's not meant to be an accusation, but I believe there had been a problem with like a two-factor authentication thing on Coinbase at one point. But there are also many examples of people having been attacked and having their Coinbase accounts or other exchange accounts drained, much in the same way that people imagine would happen with someone having self-custody. The idea is like if you have self-custody, then they can get your seed from you, but they can also get your password to Coinbase, and these institutions can add on additional measures for how money can be withdrawn, what kind of authentication is needed to access an account. But at that point, it is becoming in many ways just as complex for the user, needing to make sure it's like, for instance, not only is your Coinbase account secure, but also your email, also making sure your phone is secure, as well as making sure your two-factor is using a proper form of two-factor and not something like SMS. It can actually become rather complex. And so as far as using one of these agents, there are things like it's not when you're outsourcing that to the agent, there's still a lot of things that have to be done. This goes back to Nick Szabo's article of trusted third parties are security holes. Now that doesn't mean that trusted third parties should not exist at all in any circumstance, but recognizing that when that outsourcing is being done, it's changing who is responsible for any particular thing, not so much actually for real, like catching the security flaw. And so in that case, the things like self-custody put it on much more full display what the full responsibilities of dealing with private key material are, whereas with the institutions, it can sometimes be easy to imagine that you're solving a problem more than you actually are. That also being said, there are ways in which we could see advantages for certain security models to have that. So I don't want to make any kind of universal statements about these things, but rather just understand what are the realities of outsourcing to an agent. And the broad point being that it does not magically plug the security hole. It changes the nature of how to deal with that security hole. So, despite this, there are still a lot of Bitcoin agents. The practice of storing Bitcoins in web wallets like those provided by Coinbase and Circle abounds. People are still used to dealing with banks as a necessary evil and are not yet comfortable with the skills required to safeguard a private key. This is a problem because it means Bitcoin adoption requires a real change in people's habits. Everything that helps people learn new habits is greatly appreciated. The only solutions to the agency problem are either to remove agents or to remove their agency. In other words, people must either take control of their own Bitcoins, or if they do not wish to, they must cede control of their Bitcoins in a way that does not give control to an agent. The only way to do this is to spread the control over many different parties who are not expected to collude. This could be done with multi-sig wallets or open transaction voting pools. This is a fairly drastic solution because it means no one can do anything with the Bitcoins on his agency alone. And yeah, I think it's fair to say that web wallets, basically using a third-party custodian for Bitcoin has remained very popular in Bitcoin. And in some ways, self-custody is I don't know what the numbers are, so I don't want to claim any particular balance here. But clearly, a lot of people store money with companies like Coinbase, and That being said, these organizations themselves are often using multi-sig within their own systems, or some kind of other. It's a different form of it, but like the multi-party computation. So having basically some kind of form of Shamir's secret sharing, which tries to, but both of which, with their own trade-offs, trying to separate out single modes of failure. But even this is something that individuals have to consider as well. I think it's a reality of Bitcoin where that both individuals and institutions then have to deal with, which is if you have private key material, you have to consider what risks you face so that you can, safeguard that material or create, multi-party setups to avoid those risks. And I do think that that's an interesting point, that it sort of does reduce agency in the sense of any specific thing that's removing you from being able to just snap your fingers and use your Bitcoins when it requires different processes and such. It does increase the sort of transaction costs of different uses of Bitcoin. Putting it into deep cold storage does mean that Bitcoin is not going to be available in the next 5 minutes if there's something you want to buy. So that requires a different kind of planning. And then certain setups that would invite others to be participating in it, say like a collaborative custody with Unchained Capital or something of the sort, can also just mean that you still have unilateral control, but with certain limitations.
Yep, I don't have anything to add to that.
Yeah, well, so let's get into, I guess, how this deals with the actual institutions themselves. Bitcoin institutions. The agency problem becomes especially interesting when it comes to Bitcoin organizations, because an organization has no autonomy of its own, and all its members act as agents to it. All, whether employees or owners, have a similar incentive and ability to steal that other Bitcoin agents have. This is not a new problem, but Bitcoin gives it a new character. An organization inherently cannot take control of its own Bitcoins, so its only solution is to remove the agency of its own employees and owners. It is not enough for an organization to distribute keys between its own people, although that will help. However, it is much easier for people within an organization to collude than without. And furthermore, within an organization, people will tend to have similar characters, so the probabilities that each one is a bad actor are not independent of one another. Votes must come from different organizations in order to maximize the security of the wallet. And I do think that we've seen since this, obviously multi-sig existed at the time, but we've seen the development of like we said, Unchained Capital and other sort of collaborative businesses that have take these kinds of things seriously and try to aid the individual without taking away unilateral control. In which case, a lot of this is. What it sort of reveals to me is not necessarily like, okay, institutions are at odds with Bitcoin, but rather there's a lot that I think Bitcoiners need to learn about institutional controls that, have existed for a long time, to think better about how Bitcoin custody plays into it. And perhaps over time, there's additional technologies, cryptographic tools that can be used that align themselves with these kinds of institutional controls that already exist or can continue to develop to make it better at being a Bitcoin institution. But I think I disagree with this idea of Bitcoin sort of being at odds with institutions.
Well, I do think that if you were to look at maybe the demographics of Bitcoiners, that if you're very individualistic and you're very tech savvy, then having any institutions involved just seems annoying because you don't need that, or you feel like you don't need that. And you can do a multi-sig on your own and all that. And so, well, although, even if you use I would take it further. Like if you use multi-sig on your own, you're using a hardware wallet that was built by an institution, a corporation, right? Unless it turns into like autarky at some point, right? Where you're like, oh, I'm going to build my own hardware wallet and I'm going to write my own Bitcoin node implementation. That way, I'm not relying on any third-party institutions in any way. And, you're designing your own processor to avoid Intel backdoors and all that. So I think even the most rugged individualists within Bitcoin draw the line somewhere where they say, I'm going to accept the division of labor. And the debate is purely one about where do you draw the line? And so I think that it's I think drawing the line of, as you pointed out, unilateral control, that's a pretty strong line to draw. I think that one makes a lot of sense. But even, then you could look at privacy, for example, like, well, where do you draw the line on that? And so there's just so many different factors that often come down to subjective valuation and assessment of risks rather than some kind of objectively knowable absolute.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think here, Bitcoin's rugged individualism, from my perspective, is less a prescriptive call. I'm not sure. Based on how this article is written, I think that Daniel had a bit of a more prescriptive view of it, but also a bit of a descriptive, like just this is the reality of Bitcoin, therefore it tends itself towards this thing. But others in Bitcoin have certainly taken a more prescriptive view of like if you use any particular thing outside of this range of computational actions, then you are not participating in Bitcoin sufficiently purely enough. And where I see the Bitcoin's rugged individualism is less about the idea that you must have this purely individualist point of view, which, as you point out, is going to eventually break down. It is autarky. And for people who don't know, I mean, that basically means like 100% full self-sufficiency. And that to me is it's something that can't exist in reality. Like at some point you're dealing, at some point you're dealing with just dependence on God's creation or something. Just like the idea that there's things in nature for you to even make use of at all. So I think that there are limits to what you can do simply as an individual. However, where it's actually interesting for Bitcoin and why it matters so much in Bitcoin, and one of the powers of Bitcoin is the fact that you can be as individualistic as you are capable of being. So there are certain things about gold, for instance. If you want to store gold, the idea of building your own gold vault is one that requires a lot of resources and extreme costs with storage and transportation and so on and so forth to actually make happen. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's relatively straightforward. It's actually, for the most part, take away some of the, computational supply chain type stuff. It's effectively, well, do you know how to generate a private key? And that's not exactly rocket science. It's pretty straightforward for most people to create a private key if they wish to learn what that means and how to do it. And then you have a backup you can put in your head and so on and so forth. So you can take a very individualistic approach. And what that means is, for those times where you come into contact with reality and realize that you have some need from other people, you can go into that with much more stronger and more precise demands on what is being offered, so that you can actually address the risks you have with fewer negative trade-offs. And I don't think that can be understated, because I think that will radically change the landscape of what it means to engage with the financial system. Starting your own bank does not take, this whole, creating a charter and like hoping, the government plays nice. It's like, it's literally just going on a computer, almost any computer that you can get your hands on, any chip. And there's some way to generate, 256 ones and zeros that can act as your Swiss bank account. And so when you go then to other people, it's like, okay, well, I need, say like a hardware wallet. You can have stronger demands. It's like, okay, what does that mean? What do I want out of this? Because there's certain things. If you don't provide what I want, there is a sufficient like threshold where I'm willing to go do it myself. And there's always that at every sort of point in dealing with Bitcoin, there is that threshold. And so that makes everyone engaged with it have to, kind of improve their offerings. I think it will lead to better business ethics. And I think it's just, it fundamentally improves everyone's relationships to everyone else, to the point where I actually think it sort of improves trust among individuals and institutions because of the fact that they are more aware of the trade-offs they're dealing with and what each one is actually providing, and having sort of a way out if needed. Everything is opt-in Bitcoin, and I think that's the key thing.
Yeah, in business negotiation, they have an acronym BAT, which is Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. And so your ability to negotiate is determined by what's the alternative to that. What happens if you walk away? And Bitcoin really gives you a very powerful BATNA, and it, I think, does. So it's interesting too when we look at specifically. Let's look at Coinbase. Okay, so I will throw an accusation at them, which is that historically they've had trouble with customer service and customer support.
Yes.
And so I actually think that ought to be their advantage as an institution, is that I always tell people, hey, look, with Bitcoin, there's no customer support line for you to call. And so having that, I think it probably is of value to a lot of people out there who do want customer support to come with their Bitcoin. And so that, I think, is like when institutions are thinking about their BATNA, like what is their valuable service that only they can provide and cannot be provided by just, autarky.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think we've even seen the development of Bitcoin brokers who, well, what are their advantages? Well, they focus only on Bitcoin because they don't want to get distracted by the complicated engineering of keeping up with Fartcoin and everything else under the sun. And then you also have, as the example you gave, basically companies that also focus very heavily on the the customer support side, so that, if you're trusting a custodian with a large portion of wealth, then you want to make sure that it's, you have someone you can call and make sure everything is working exactly as you please. And so there are companies that heavily focus on customer support as well, and that's something that people should demand. Then you also have companies who really, in many ways, their benefit is just the fact that, and this kind of goes along with customer support, but I think it's beyond that as well, because it deals with various, kind of legal stuff. There's a lot of just need for humans still in this world. Nick Szabo has stuff about wet code versus dry code, and dry code is computer code. It's written there in, plain, programming language that can be told to a machine and is just like highly rational and logical and just does exactly, what's written there on the screen. Whereas wet code are basically things that still exist within the realm of like human institutions. You need a guy for all sorts of different things. They know how to handle this and that. And a lot of the glue between things. There's a lot of like tacit knowledge. There's a lot of things that humans are still actually good for. And for those, there are also companies that focus on basically allowing those human relationships to develop. So it's like the point of this is because there is a human over there that you can work with that will hold your hand through things or help with the sort of legal proceedings with things like inheritance and so on and so forth. And so these businesses, in fiat, you get to just exist because of government regulation and all kinds of stuff, just basically ensuring that you get to just have a business. Whereas with Bitcoin, like you say, this BATNA, there's always that alternative, and so people have to compete actually on providing real services. So continuing on, criminal organizations. Whereas individuals can do whatever they want with their Bitcoins, organizations must seek outside approval. They must subject themselves to constant auditing in order to deserve any measure of trust. It has long been understood that Bitcoin gives more control to individuals, but the complement to that is not yet well enough understood. I believe history has shown it to be an important effect, but it is not yet clear how important it will be. Maybe people will be able to work around it, or maybe they will have to replace most organizations with distributed systems. Of course, the requirement of being constantly audited and losing control over the funds it holds is less of a problem for honest organizations. It is much worse for criminal organizations or for organizations that want to keep their internal operations secret. Mafias, cults, and governments will have a greater difficulty adapting to Bitcoin than will publicly traded companies. And I think this is where I think this is actually like in many ways true. So there was another article about an incident called the fappening, where there had been a hack of iCloud accounts for photographs that people wanted a view of celebrities, and there was a lot of Bitcoin involved with the basically this heist, and that organization that did it sort of like fell apart because people were turning on each other. This is a classic heist movie trope of you steal the diamond and then someone turns on someone else because they wanted more of the diamond. There wasn't because you're dealing in this extra legal situation, there are less incentives to actually play by rules and go into honest contracts to engage in ethical business. That's why you're criminals. They also, criminality in some sense is almost an inherently high time preference by virtue of being done in a way that is contrary to long-term sustainability, long-term ability to get along with others, and so on and so forth. And so it naturally brings together people who are not going to be able to work together well. And so I think, as far as how history has played out, I think we described basically what's going on is businesses that are capable of appealing to or providing for the real human institutional needs that people have because they can't, that there is some thing that they are incapable of doing on their own. Those businesses are thriving, and they tend to thrive off levels of honesty by being well known, having a good reputation for things like customer support. And criminal organizations actually have, a harder time dealing with that, in the sense of, obviously there are a lot of criminal organizations out there that exist. They do a lot of scams. They try to call people as groups and, get their hands on people's Bitcoins. But those organizations are naturally going to have a lot harder time dealing with the natural implications of Bitcoin key management controls to make sure that people are actually able to work together. How well can you actually keep one of these scam rings together in the long run? And I don't mean just a few years of people scamming. It's like, I don't think you're going to see, this is just speculation, but I would be surprised if you saw a scam ring continuing to exist well into the future. A family business of scam rings, especially too because their business being based on an adversarial position is constantly being fought against by the anti-fragile nature of Bitcoin, trying to basically route around these things. The whole point is to avoid falling trapped. So there's a bit of that kind of arms race, but I think there is a distinct disadvantage for those trying to maintain any kind of long-term, basically Bitcoin treasury strategy, if they are actual criminals.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it in 2025, it really is astonishing to read that, he mentions publicly traded companies here adopting Bitcoin, which was very prophetic.
Yes, and we see in practice, at time of recording, the U.S. government established a strategic reserve, but it's also very unclear what the progress on that is and how they actually plan to go about handling the keys, which does cause issues. And that itself is sort of a damnation of previous administrations and their ways of thinking about this, because they were so disregarding of Bitcoin that they did not develop any serious Bitcoin controls at all. So it's almost, and as far as I know, at time of recording, the audit that had been slated to occur has either not occurred yet, or it has not been made public. And as just ordinary layman citizen, it's very unclear how well the government managed to actually hold any of its keys at all. And so it's a huge up in the air thing of how is this big organization actually holding things? And cause for concern is, one, the disregard in the sense of not caring about Bitcoin means that it's very possible, some guy in some agency somewhere actually managed to lose some keys because it just wasn't taken seriously enough when Bitcoin was had a lower price point. But then you also have the concerns of, we have had, explicit examples of, prior to this article, during the Silk Road investigation, there were, rogue agents that sort of ran off with their own Bitcoin. Now, some of those got prosecuted and all that. But the point is, these things can really exist. And the government really is well behind publicly traded companies in the process of being able to establish, a trust with the public about how they're actually handling any Bitcoins that are under their control. Meanwhile, we have, there are companies like River that have a proof of reserves that anyone can go online and check against, and that has its limits of what it actually proves about the company balance sheet, but it does, it does move the needle in terms of making you sure about specific claims within that balance sheet about, what the company has. And the government has not adapted to that nearly as quickly as actual private businesses. So continuing on, All organizations tend to evolve so as to resist change, but governments, being subject to the problems of socialism, suffer much worse from this because government operations lack a clear concept of efficiency, their overall success, the relative importance of any of its parts, or the relative merits of alternative organizational structuring. Consequently, governments can more easily evolve into labyrinthian structures that nobody understands without anyone realizing what is happening. An eye-opening article called Sinkhole of Bureaucracy describes a surreal example of this phenomenon in an outstandingly incisive way. In an abandoned Pennsylvania mine, which is now an office containing 600 federal employees and endless filing cabinets, process all the federal retirement pensions by paper by hand. The system is widely understood to be insane and dysfunctional, but despite repeated and ceaseless attempts to automate the process beginning in the early 80s, the system has not changed. It is not a problem of will, but of knowledge. There is no one available with the skills to carry through the transition successfully, no one who knows precisely what those skills would be, and no one who can evaluate anyone else for them. As a result, the attempts to develop an automated process failed because the software engineers did not understand the laws and the bureaucracy well enough to design something correctly, and the bureaucrats did not know how to tell if the software engineers knew what they were doing. Will the federal government be able to adapt to Bitcoin? This would require building a system not just for the one department, but for the entire organization. And it would have to be built properly. It must just distribute decisions enough so that Bitcoins cannot be stolen easily by employees. After reading that article, I think it is reasonable to think that the government may not be up to such a task at all. And for those who may have been paying attention to some of the activities of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, in this year 2025, this sinkhole of bureaucracy might actually be familiar because this exact mine, this facility, became a hot topic within it. And it was actually funny because there were people who were suddenly defending this bureaucracy, this bureaucratic thing. And to note, this article that's written and all included in the show notes was from the Washington Post, so not a bastion of conservative thinking. So this mine, which mind you, the physical location makes sense as a place to be storing government material. So it's always made sense to put things in the side of a mountain or whatever else as a secure vault for materials that need to be kept very safe. In this case, the federal retirement pensions. But yeah, it's been a problem for decades, and no one has managed to go in and fix it, including, as far as I understand, the Doge team, I don't think did much to change this exact thing. And I think Daniel actually makes a great point here that there's also just there is the will problem of like, hey, can we, you have to want people, you have to have people who want to make change no matter what. But in this case, even when you do, and of course you have people who decide they no longer have that will because they're mad at maybe who's doing it or whatever. But there also is just a pure knowledge problem of when you've already created such a labyrinth of bureaucracy. It's not necessarily like a simple refactor, so to speak, to bring that to something that's more streamlined, because it has taken on much more complex processes than any one individual is going to be able to kind of make sense of. The bureaucracy takes up a life of its own. And so if this is the case, an organization that is prone to that kind of bureaucratic situation is probably going to have a hard time transitioning into Bitcoin. On the other hand, and this is up for the government to decide if they want for themselves or not, with what they have now in Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin is fresh, it is a chance to start fresh with that specific set of holdings for a strategic reserve. and other government holdings of Bitcoin, they do have the opportunity, if they want, to have a clean system that uses sort of the state of the art understanding of how to do these institutional controls with Bitcoin and handle the key management. And so it's on them to do it. But of course, this does give, reason to be skeptical of how well the bureaucracy will or will not manage to address it. And from the government's perspective, they just need to understand that itself is opening them up to a risk of either loss of the Bitcoins because of losing keys, which is usually how people lose their Bitcoin, is not because of theft, but because of shooting themselves in the foot in some way, losing a backup or something of the sort. Or having to deal with rogue employees, which, as I said, it does have a precedence in the government. Although I'm not going to make any claims as to how much of a threat that in particular is.
Yeah, I like Columbus's bill that kind of lays out how to minimize that threat. So it really is a smart way to do it, where you've got a multi-sig and you've got different people involved. And the other thing too is that what's interesting about the government is you have locations like, for example, you could have a private key be on a nuclear submarine, right? And it's not like they could themselves do anything with that one key, but it's a unique opportunity compared to individuals.
Yeah. It's like in Mission Impossible with the key that they have to the big AI is on that Russian submarine.
and you can also put it in space too. Once you have nation state resources like that, you can put your private keys or one of the private keys on the dark side of the moon, where basically anybody could see if somebody goes to access it.
Yeah, and then a lot of people don't even believe you have access to it at all.
Yeah, it's at a movie studio in Hollywood.
That's especially good OPSEC, right? You don't even know if it's all decoys all the way down. So yes, you're right, and perhaps Space Force does have a reason to be involved with Bitcoin, running a node, a satellite node in space, and then also having a separate satellite that holds some portion of key material. So yeah, they actually, this is a real test of government if they want to prove libertarians wrong, because they have sort of a greenfield opportunity to establish a new form of treasury holdings, and they have all the resources in the world to try to do something, but they need to decide, do they want to fall for the bureaucratic traps? I had something else and I lost my train of thought. I cannot remember. So yeah, I think I do think that Bitcoin's rugged individualism, I do think poses a lot of threats for bureaucracy. I think it actually is sort of perhaps in some sense like anti-bureaucratic in the sense I'm just thinking here that because of the fact that one of the actual risks is losing access, not by theft. That's what's focused here. But like actually, historically, what's been a big problem is people losing backups. People lose their seed phrase, people lose their like a passphrase they added to the seed phrase, and so on and so forth. And that's been a real problem for people. And you can talk to people who work at hardware wallet companies about that, because they're the ones who are dealing with all of the customer support, helping people or trying to help people who have gone through those situations. With that, it means that is actually a huge risk. So any business that takes their Bitcoin holdings seriously either does have to just outsource altogether, which kind of minimizes the bureaucratic risks on their side of the equation towards Bitcoin, or they have to actually be sort of anti-bureaucratic to make sure that whatever happens is not so bad that they can make sure that those keys get checked properly. I do wonder if we'll see the development of basically SOC 2 type principles or measures that are specific to, and maybe they actually already are, but like cryptographic material, especially ones with a sort of multi-sig dimension. You would know more about SOC compliance than me because it's just something that I've heard in corporations, but didn't have to actually think about myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about splitting up the responsibilities so that you don't have one person kind of going rogue, but it's also about documenting that. And so I think that, contrast with an individual where they might have like, oh, I'm gonna pass my Bitcoin down and I'm gonna create a treasure map, and my descendants will have to follow the treasure map to, put together the key material. It's really interesting that in a corporation, like the corporation's expected to live forever, and so one is that it avoids that issue of inheritance, but it also creates that like documented process around handling the key material and being transparent about that. And then also attaching civil and criminal liability to not doing that. And so, one of the reasons why we haven't really had a whole lot of Enrons since Enron is because Sarbanes-Oxley, it actually, from a libertarian perspective, you'd say, well, it's too stringent. And so that's why we also have fewer publicly traded companies than we otherwise would have. And that, it went too far in the other direction. But we also have to be clear-eyed about the positive impact of that, which is that it's just a lot riskier as an insider to, for lack of a better word, F around than it was in the past. And certainly it sets a higher standard than, what you want to do reasonably as an individual.
Yes. So if they outsource to a custodian, the actual custodian itself is subject to those same incentives. And I think something to draw from what you're saying is that, Bitcoiners are prone to think much more highly of the individual, and with many good reasons, many good ideas around liberty and such. But as far as the liberal tradition in the sort of libertarian sense is not against corporations and such. And those corporations, in many ways, they are a lower time preference means of dealing with increasingly larger amounts of capital. So I think we just have a lot to learn as Bitcoiners about institutional structures and what is actually bad about them, and what can be improved with Bitcoin. What do we have to learn from them? And I think, at least I'm speaking for myself, that's sort of an open question, much like, we would argue that, the problem isn't banks, the problem is central banking. And so likewise, maybe we shouldn't, shudder at just, the statement, the existence of institutions, but in particular, like what institutions and what part of the institutions. And what I was trying to think of earlier too, which is, for governments in the history of warfare, people have always went to the vaults, almost first. It's like the thing you want to do is find the gold, whether that's, finding the Aztec gold or finding the Nazi gold. There's a desire to get your hands on enemy gold. And so, governments probably do need to figure this stuff out to make them more protected within warfare scenarios and being able to defend themselves. So I think this article is Harsher on institutions than I think it ought to be, but I think it brings up very important points of Bitcoin's individualistic nature, such that I think it will actually help institutions become better institutions than they otherwise would be in a fiat society. Did you have anything else to add, Pierre?
No, we can keep going.
That's the end of the article.
Oh,
All
okay,
that's left.
all right.
I'm not going to play it on here, but there's a clip of that office in the movie Brazil that I highly recommend people go and watch because it's very funny, and it is quite humorous to imagine these people trying to make sense of Bitcoin or make use of Bitcoin, because it very much is at odds with this kind of work. Bitcoin, I think, will help streamline organizations towards their highest economic value and not allow so much parasitism and sort of, just tumors of bureaucracy, malignant tumors of bureaucracy.
I agree. So it's a great movie. People should watch it. I would also add that individuals holding keys, you do actually need some kind of institution that's providing physical security. We've seen a lot of situations back in, where I'm from, Paris, France, people getting kidnapped or attempted kidnappings to ransom for their Bitcoin. And if you don't want that situation, you need to have some kind of security, and that can be provided by, anarcho-capitalist private corporations and insurance companies, et cetera. Or it can be provided by, a monopoly on the use of force through the state, kind of the minarchist vision. But nevertheless, I don't think that there's an individual solution to physical security, other than as like a last resort, which you probably don't want to be exercising of like, oh yeah, I had to fight off a kidnapping, on a daily basis. I've got a large number of firearms. I've killed 400 people over the past 5 years. It's like what kind of world are we living in that you're constantly like in a Mad Max situation? So
yeah,
you need to have some kind of social institutions that curb that criminality.
Yeah. And the idea that you would be saving up all that Bitcoin and hoping for this like broad change in how the world is run, because your ultimate desire is to spend all of your time being holed up in a bunker fighting off the hordes of people trying to steal your money. That, to me, speaking for myself, that does not sound like the highest form of human existence, but rather like just an extreme Hobbesian, like nasty, brutish, and short way of living that I'm not exactly interested in. But at the same time, like that doesn't need to mean that the Leviathan has to be a solution to that. In fact, we may see many new business models and new ways of leveraging Bitcoin's properties to actually make it much easier to administer certain kinds of security, because of the fact that you can have different forms of watchtowers keeping an eye on things, and keys themselves are mere numbers. So there's all kinds of different ways of splitting them up and doing interesting things with them. So, the future is open for entrepreneurs to come up with new entrepreneurial, like new solutions to these, old problems in ways that we couldn't have imagined. So for instance, like with, getting the vaults, when you have multi-sig, that is a fundamental change in the nature of any kind of treasury. You never had that before. And that surely changes the costs of security in a profound, a historically profound way. And last thing I'll note is, I guess what's interesting is like once you start thinking about, inheritance with the Bitcoin, you've you've also inherently stepped out of an individualist frame, because suddenly the Bitcoin is not just about you, it's also about a family or some other group of people that you're wishing to share your wealth with. So it's sort of necessarily not purely individualistic. And with that, the typical legal structures that develop around that are effectively, like something like a trust is effectively creating, corporations around these things that start to mirror that. And it is, without making it crass, it really does sort of turn a family into a sort of a business structure, or rather it adds a business structure to the operations of the family to aid in these economic stuff. And so, yeah, institutional stuff matters even for the individual, as long as you are not a pure individual living in the wild, making your own bespoke computational devices from the twigs and berries that you're finding outside. You're dealing with other people, and it's very exciting to see how much Bitcoin will improve our ability to work with those other people and actually secure wealth better, both by ourselves and with others.
Yeah, I was digging into what are the oldest corporations that are still around, and it basically splits up between family-owned corporations and then corporations that essentially became nationalized and became a part of the government. And that's like seems like the two long-term equilibrium outcomes for corporations.
Yes, in which case I would imagine that Bitcoiners tend to be more interested in the sort of family-owned, and for very good reason. So, but even with that, you do have to think institutionally about what that means for the ability to take that through the ages.
Yeah, and also to think through how does Bitcoin change the dynamic where if in the past you had corporations that got nationalized where the government, seized the means of production, what does that look like when the assets on the corporation's balance sheet are Bitcoin? And so, how much easier is it to move the assets out of that jurisdiction and out of the control of that government so that it can't be nationalized? So maybe, going forward, if we get the opportunity to record an update podcast in like 500 years, we'll look back and see, this actually opened up a third path where you have corporations that are not family owned, but also did not get seized by the government because they had that mobility of capital between jurisdictions that led them to being, not a sovereign like Bitcoin, right? Where then we'll have a hierarchy of sovereignty of number one is Bitcoin. That's like the global sovereign. Number two is Bitcoin treasury companies that are above number three, which is governments.
Yes, that's very fascinating to think on. And I think, part of what this article even, alluded to is like the future is still open on this stuff. And I think our recommendation here is just to think a little more deeper about institutions, and not merely in the sort of fiat sense that we've sort of inherited in the modern world, but institutions more fundamentally, because there may be a much more interesting future that benefits us all from thinking that way. And Brian Johnson might have to sit in for me on that episode in 500 years, but God willing, we'll get to have that episode, and I look forward to seeing what came to be.
Yeah, or we'll watch down from heaven as our descendants record that podcast.
Yes. So we shall see. All right. Well, thank you, Pierre, for joining me on that. Thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute. dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring this and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.